Welcome to part 2 of the mollusk videos. This is following on from our last slide where we were talking about the 5 different classes of mollusks that we're going to be looking at. The first is Polyplacophora, and most of you will probably be familiar with these things. You'll have seen them when you've been down, turned over a rock at the intertidal zone or something in that area, and you may have seen them out, and you think, what is that thing? It looks a bit like a snail, but it's not really like a snail because it's got all of these plates, these little breaks, these joins in the shell, and then this girdle around it. It's a funny looking thing. It's not, it's not a limpet. And so what it is, it's called a chitin. And these are in the class Polyplacophora. Poly meaning many, and then placophora means plate bearing. So they've got the shell composed of 8 valves, and valves are what we call shells. So like bivalves, or another name for gastropods, sometimes is univalve. One shell, bivalves, 2 shells. These ones are 8 of these valves or shell plates, and then they've got a margin around the outside, okay, called the girdle, and that is made up of a thickened area of the mantle. Okay, so as we've seen before, if you are a big bag of tissue that's sitting in the marine environment, something's going to come along and eat you unless you've got some protection. And so these ones have not only camouflage protection, but also a toughening, thickening, scaly sort of area around this part of the mantle, and that's called the girdle. Okay, so the very simple structure. We have what looks like a pawa turned over here, but you'll see that it's a little different than a pawa, obviously with the 8 plates. But when you look at this thing turned over, you'll see that there's the foot. Okay, so here's your muscular foot. Okay, and here's the mouth, and then the mantle coming all around. We call it a girdle in this class, but this is the mantle, which secretes the shell, and it doesn't have much in terms of civilization, but a very poorly developed head with a mouth, and then all the internal cavities up in this visceral mass or bag of guts that overlies the foot, and then so the food goes through, gets digested, comes out the anus. But also they have water currents that are that come in from the front. The water currents come in from the front, go over these feathered gills, and you can see they look a bit like feathers, right? They come out on both sides. The gills come off of one central branch, and these the water comes down these, and the current also takes away the waste from the back of the body. And you'll see these things crawling around, not only subtidally, but also in the intertidal zone. And so they're a lot like limpets, where they can clamp down on the rock and then hold on, avoid desiccation, and wait until the next tide comes in, and they usually are grazers. Okay, so here's our normal trochophora larva, which we see in mollusks and polychaetes. These things develop into this settling stage, where you can see the foot starting to develop, and then the 8 plates starting to develop. Moving on to the gastropods. We have the highest diversity of the mollusk classes. The gastropod means stomach, foot, gastro. You've seen that with gastroderm, poda, okay, and pod like a podiatrist. That's foot, so stomach, foot. So they crawl around on their stomachs, and it's not really their stomach; it's their muscular foot. But generally, gastropods, you know that you're looking at a gastropod when you see your typical snail or slug form, and they'll have one shell. Okay. These are divided into three subclasses: the prosobranchs, snails, abalone, and limpets; the opistobranchs, which are nudibranchs, sea hares. These are the things without shells; and then the pulmonates, the air-breathing snails. And these are the ones that tend to be the terrestrial ones. And there's one called Amphibola crenata, which you've got in your shell collection, which is a marine pulmonate. It's the only marine pulmonate, in fact, in New Zealand. Okay. All right. So if we look at a little bit of gastropod evolution, okay, so the shell has gone from that sort of limpety Polyplacophora type shell, which was a single shell covering, to its a single shell covering the body, and it's deepened and elongated, and then started to curl up, and this allows the body of the mollusk to be retracted into it. Okay, and so the body becomes elongated to be able to fit into this protective covering as well. And this form right here is called a plano-spiral shell. It's in a straight plane, and we'll look at this a little bit more in class, but it's a plane and a spiral. Okay. Here we see what is typical of gastropods, that they've got torsion, and these are bilaterally symmetrical organisms, and you can see that if you cut this right down the line here, that just at this head part, that the two sides would be equal, but mirror images of each other. But they've also got this twisting of the body, and so it's bilateral, but the body twists over in this direction. So this plane of symmetry can't be cut in one line; it has to be cut in a twisting line. Sort of like a banana down to the side, and that is called torsion, and that helps it fit into an asymmetrical shell. And the shell can get a lot stronger by having this spiraled build on itself. So it spirals, and it can use not only this this column down the center, all right, but the columella, but also the other edges of these whorls in order to give it structural support. So it becomes much stronger and smaller, more compact since it's asymmetrical. That's called torsion. Okay, so the shell's been moved up to the top, so they carry it, okay, and most of them will have something called an operculum, which closes the aperture of the shell, the aperture being the opening, and so essentially the operculum is a trapdoor. This shows the action of the operculum closing up the animal into its shell, and you'll see this is what we call the cat's eye in the cat's eye snail. You'll see this the eye part, the green colored and white colored part that looks something like a cat's eye. It will be pulled in. You can see this. Here's the body of the snail pulling into the shell, pulled in, and here we go, the cutaway. Here's this trap door that gives the animal full protection from the outside environment. And sometimes they can close these up and keep a little bit of water in there to avoid desiccation as well. Here, we'll be looking at these in lab a little more closely, but these are the features of a gastropod shell. Okay, this shows you all the parts of the shell. The apex is the very top. Each one of these twists around is called a whorl. The spire is the area of all of the twists around from the last one. So this is the spire, and some spires are very, very short, like cone shells and all, which are almost flat on top, and then you get also some quite elongated ones, like here, where the spire is a lot higher. Okay, and so that spire height is something that's used to identify different shells. Okay, so the aperture is the opening, all right, just like a camera aperture. And then around the opening, there's the outer lip, the inner lip, okay, and then what we call the siphonal canal. Now, not all gastropods have this canal and siphon, but we'll be having a closer look at those a little bit later. This is called the siphonal canal if it is present. All right, so let's look at some of the subclasses. The prosobranchs. All right, you will not need to know Archaeogastropoda, Mesogastropoda, or Neogastropoda for your exam. Okay, these are the orders that we're going to be looking at, and they can be thought of in terms of evolutionary development as the older one, archaeo, sort of as an archaeology, looking back at the past, meso being middle, and neo or new gastropods. So the oldest, the middle, and the new gastropods, and these ones were the first to appear in the fossil record. The Mesogastropoda next, and the Neogastropod finally. Okay, so they've got some major differences, and we will look at those to look at how they have allowed them to radiate into lots more habitats. Okay. So here we have Archaeogastropods. This is a slit shell, Barotrochus midas, feeding on a sponge at a depth of about 2,500 feet in the Bahamas. Okay, this is from a NOAA photo. Okay, so you can see that it's rasping away with its radula here. You can't see that, but you can see that the body of it is out to feed on this sponge. Okay, not high quality food sponges generally, because they're fairly poisonous. They've got their chemical protections, but you can call this is a slit shell. You can see from this long line in here. This is what gives them their names. So it's grazing on the sponge. Here are some more examples of the slits in the slit shells. Here there are opercula. Okay, these are, remember, the trapdoors that cover the shell, the body of the shell when it retreats into its, the body of the mollusk when it retreats into its shell. Some of the other Archaeogastropoda, Pawa. Okay, not very deep shells. Okay, limpets, and you can imagine in the original development of mollusks and their shells, it probably was something very simple that would have allowed them to hide underneath. And this one is in its home scar, what's called its home scar, where it retreats to every low tide and rests, and then it grazes from this very small area and then returns to it. So this is a limpet. Okay, and then there we go. This is a top shell. Okay, so it's not a slit snail, but it is a grazer, grazing along. Okay, and then these Mesogastropoda. Okay, we will come back to it a little bit later. Okay, the Archaeogastropods retained. So these things have the primitive paired gills, the bipectinate like feather. All right. If you look at the Polyplacophora ones, okay, this is again like a feather. Okay, gills on both sides. This will become a little more important as we go on and look at other gills within the mollusks. And they have a large surface area, but they can get damaged quite easily by soft sediment or by sediment that's in the water column and flowing past them. So these things are restricted to hard, rocky, benthic habitats. All right, so if you are looking at grazers that are, or if you're looking at really any snail that's out on the sand, then you know it's not going to be an Archaeogastropod because it won't be able to deal with that hard or with that soft sediment. Same thing with the fine sediment of the estuaries. So if you look at muddy habitats as well, you know you're not going to be looking at an Archaeogastropod. Okay, they graze on fine algae and other organisms on rock surfaces, so they're all grazers. All right. Of course, you may find some hard surfaces with Archaeogastropods within those sandy or muddy habitats, but not on the mud and sand themselves. They just won't be there. Okay. Very similar again to and you can start to see how the body plan of these mollusks is very similar. Okay, so we've got the muscular foot here. You can see the mantle with its little projections, which give it sensory function, or that have sensory function. It allows it to sense the environment outside of the shell. And then there's the shell next to the mantle. And here's the gill. There may be multiple gills. And then the visceral mass will be between the foot and the mantle. Okay, the mantle is like a blanket that covers the foot and the visceral mass. It's sort of like it's like a tarp that goes over the rest of the body, but it's also the shell will follow the same dimensions in a way as the mantle. You'll see that the lining of the mantle will usually be right next to the edge of the mantle will be right next to the edge of the shell because it's laying down the next layer. Okay. Archaeogastropods don't copulate. They broadcast spawn generally. The eggs are planktonic, and they go through the typical trochophora and velager stage and then settle. Okay, so they tend to be the grazers that we're going to see.